In 1244, the City of London created a position called the Assayer of Bread. His only responsibility was to examine bread sold in the city's markets and determine whether it was, in fact, bread. Not whether it was fresh, not whether it tasted good, not whether it was safe to eat, whether it was bread at all, whether the substance being sold as bread contained enough actual flour to qualify. The fact that this job needed to exist in a city of 50,000 people who depended on bread as the single largest source of daily calories tells you everything about what was happening at the medieval English market. Somebody was selling something that looked like bread and was not bread. Enough somebodies that the city created an official position to deal with it. And the assayer, armed with a knife, a scale, and the authority to confiscate, was the front line of a regulatory system that controlled what it could measure and ignored what it could not. That system is what this video is about. And by the time we're done, the bread will be the least of the problems. The bread starts the story because bread was the foundation. In 1200s England, bread accounted for more daily calories than any other food. It was eaten at every meal. It was so central to the economy that its price was regulated by royal statute, the Assize of Bread, first formalized in 1266, which tied the price and weight of a loaf to the current cost of grain. If grain was expensive, the loaf was smaller. If grain was cheap, the loaf was larger. The system was elegant and enforceable. It controlled the transaction. What it did not control, what nobody controlled, was what was inside the loaf. And what was inside the loaf was, frequently, not entirely flour. The economics of adulteration were straightforward. A baker bought grain at market price. He had it ground into flour. He baked loaves at the legally mandated weight. His profit margin was whatever grain cost him versus what the loaf sold for, a margin that was, in most years, painfully thin. The temptation to stretch the flour was constant and rational. The most common adulterant was chalk, ground limestone that was white, cheap, and visually indistinguishable from flour once baked into a loaf. Sand was another. It added weight, which helped meet the Assize standard, and was nearly invisible in coarse ground medieval flour. Bean flour and pea flour were common substitutes that changed the taste but not the appearance. Sawdust, in extreme cases, was documented. Ground bones were alleged in some complaints. The loaf looked right. It weighed right. It was not right. The assayer's job was to catch this, to cut loaves open, examine the interior texture and color, and identify bread that contained too little actual grain. When he caught a baker, the punishment was public and designed to humiliate. The baker was drawn through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame dragged along the ground with the offending loaf hung around his neck. Or he was placed in the pillory, where he stood in the public square with his head and hands locked through holes in a wooden board while passers-by expressed their opinions. These punishments were documented because they happened regularly. The City of London recorded multiple pillory sentences for bread adulteration in any given decade. The system caught some bakers. The system did not catch all bakers. And the bakers it did not catch continued selling chalk bread to families who could not tell the difference. Because chalk bread, when baked properly, looks and feels almost exactly like real bread. The difference only becomes apparent inside the body, over time, as the nutritional value of what should have been the primary calorie source turns out to be significantly less than what was needed. There was another problem with the bread that had nothing to do with deliberate adulteration. The grinding process itself, stone querns or water mills, shed fragments of stone into the flour. This was not fraud. This was physics. Every loaf contained microparticles of quernstone, baked into the dough, invisible to the eye, and devastating to the teeth over years. We covered this in the alehouse video, but it's worth repeating in the market context because the scale is different. The alehouse served bread to its customers. The market sold bread to the entire city. Every household, every day, for every meal. The cumulative dental destruction, teeth ground flat by 30, abscesses, jaw infections, was not caused by one bad baker. It was caused by the only milling technology available. The system was not failing. The system was working. And the product it produced was, grain by grain, destroying the mouth of every person who ate it. Now, the butcher. If the bread was a slow problem, the meat was a fast one. In 1200s England, there was no refrigeration. None. Meat was slaughtered, cut, and sold on the same day, or it was not sold at all, because by the second day in any season warmer than deep winter, it was visibly spoiling. The butcher's stall at a medieval market was an open-air table with cuts of meat displayed on a wooden board. Flies were constant. The smell was strong, but not unusual. Every stall smelled. Every street smelled. The entire market operated inside an atmosphere that would flatten a modern shopper in minutes. The color of the meat told the experienced buyer something, but not everything, because butchers had their own methods of managing appearance. Rubbing meat with fresh blood to restore color was documented in court cases. Washing spoiled meat in vinegar or water and reselling it as fresh was documented. Mixing old meat with fresh in pies and prepared foods was common enough that specific regulations addressed it. London's pie makers were subject to inspections that focused on exactly this practice. The regulations existed because the practice was widespread. And the practice was widespread because the economics demanded it. A butcher who threw away unsold meat at the end of the day threw away his profit. A butcher who turned yesterday's unsold cuts into today's meat pies recovered his cost. The incentive structure pointed in one direction. The regulations tried to push in another. The regulations lost. Here's the part about the butcher that changes the picture. The danger was not just the meat itself. It was the entire environment the meat existed in. The same hands that handled raw meat handled money, handled the cutting tools, and touched every subsequent purchase. The cutting board was wood, porous, absorbent, impossible to truly clean. The waste from butchering, blood, offal, bone, was supposed to be carted away to designated dumping sites. It was often dumped in the nearest ditch or into the closest waterway. If you walked through Smithfield Market on a busy morning, the ground was slick with blood and fat. The drainage channel in the center of the street carried a slow stream of organic waste toward the Fleet River. And the bacteria that thrived in this environment, organisms that would later be named Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium, had no names in the 1200s. They had no concept. They were invisible. And they were present on every surface, every tool, every hand, and every piece of meat that left the stall. A customer buying fresh meat on a summer morning had perhaps 6 to 8 hours before the product became actively dangerous. In a home with no refrigeration, that window was the difference between dinner and dysentery. And the buyer had no way of knowing where in that window the meat currently sat. Was it slaughtered this morning or yesterday evening? The butcher's word was the only information available, and the butcher's word was worth exactly as much as the butcher's incentive to tell the truth, which was, in a market with no testing and no enforcement mechanism for freshness, not very much at all. The fishmonger was, paradoxically, the most heavily regulated trader at the medieval market, and among the most dangerous. Fish spoiled faster than meat. In a coastal town with access to fresh catch, the window was measured in hours. In an inland city like London, where fish arrived by cart from the coast or by river, the product had already been traveling for a day or more before it reached the stall. The regulations were specific. Fish could only be sold on certain days. Old fish could not be mixed with fresh. Fish that had been refreshed, soaked in water to remove the smell of decay, was explicitly prohibited. The specificity of these regulations tells the familiar story. Every rule existed because someone was breaking it. The fishmonger who soaked stale fish in water and sold it as fresh was not a rare criminal. He was common enough to warrant dedicated legislation. And the buyer, standing at the stall, examining the fish by sight and smell, trying to determine whether what was being offered was this morning's catch or yesterday's carefully disguised leftovers, was relying on senses that the fishmonger had specifically worked to defeat. There is a court record from 1308 that captures the market's reality in a single case. A fishmonger named John de Welliford was prosecuted for selling putrid and unwholesome fish in Cheapside. The fish was confiscated, examined by officials, declared unfit, and publicly burned. John de Welliford was fined and briefly imprisoned. He returned to his stall within weeks. The case was notable not because it was unusual, but because it was recorded. One data point in a system where most adulteration went undetected. Most spoiled food was consumed before anyone noticed, and most illness was attributed to bad air, divine displeasure, or an imbalance of the humors, rather than to the fish bought at market that morning. The market itself, as a physical space, deserves a moment, because the environment shaped every transaction. A 1200s English market was not a building, it was a street. Stalls lined both sides, wooden tables, some with canvas overhangs, most without. The street surface was packed earth in dry weather and mud in wet. The drainage was a channel down the center that carried waste, animal and human, toward the nearest waterway. The market operated in all weather, rain, heat, frost. In summer, the temperature inside a crowded market street, surrounded by wooden buildings that trapped the heat, was significantly higher than outside it. Meat spoiled faster. Fish spoiled faster. Milk soured faster. The heat that made the shopping experience uncomfortable for the buyer was actively accelerating the deterioration of every product being sold. In winter, the cold preserved food better, but the cold also drove people to buy prepared foods, pies, hot pottage from vendors, roasted meats from cookshops. These prepared foods were made from the same ingredients, by the same traders, with the same absence of safety standards, but now with an additional step of handling and an additional window for contamination. And then there were the spices, the market's most expensive and most fraudulent category. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron. Luxury goods imported at enormous expense from Asia and the Middle East. Spices were sold by weight. The incentive to adulterate was proportional to the price. Ground pepper was mixed with charcoal, ground olive pits, or floor sweeping. Saffron, the most expensive spice in the medieval world, was adulterated with marigold petals, turmeric, or dyed animal fibers. The fraud was so pervasive and the stakes so high that specific laws addressed spice adulteration, with penalties more severe than those for bread or ale. In 1373, a spice dealer in London was pilloried for selling adulterated saffron, and the adulterated saffron was burned beneath him as he stood in the pillory. The punishment was theatrical. The problem continued. Because the buyer, even an experienced one, could not reliably distinguish pure saffron from dyed fiber in a market stall with poor lighting and no testing equipment. And the profit margin on the fraud was so large, Pure saffron cost more per ounce than many metals, that the risk of the pillory was a cost of doing business. What you are looking at when you look at the medieval market is not chaos. It is a system with rules, enforcement, and punishments. A system that controlled what it could see, weight, price, the most visible forms of fraud, and could not control what it could not see. The invisible was everything that mattered: bacteria, contamination, nutritional content, freshness at the molecular level. The system was not incompetent. It was incomplete. What the system measured and what actually killed people, the gap between those two things, was the space in which medieval life was lived. Ale, which we covered in detail in the alehouse video, was the market's most ubiquitous product. Every market had alewives selling from stalls or from their front doors nearby. The ale conner, as you might remember, tested quality by sitting in a puddle of it wearing leather trousers. If the trousers stuck, too much sugar, the brewer was fined. If they didn't stick, the ale was approved. That was the test. For a product consumed by every man, woman, and child in England, in quantities averaging 1 to 2 gallons per person per day. The ale conner did not test for contamination, wild yeast, bacterial content, or anything that would tell you whether the ale was safe to drink. He tested for a single variable, sugar content, because that was the variable the Assize addressed and the variable the city could measure. Everything else was unmeasured because everything else was unmeasurable. Not ignored, unmeasurable. The distinction matters. The cookshops deserve their own mention, because cookshops occupied a unique position in the medieval food economy, and a uniquely dangerous one. A cookshop was a stall or small establishment that sold prepared food, roasted meats, meat pies, pottage, and bread. For a laborer who had no kitchen, no time to cook, or no wife at home to prepare meals, and many medieval workers fit at least one of these categories, the cookshop was the entire meal system. Breakfast, dinner, and supper could all come from the same vendor. The problem was transparency. When you bought raw meat from the butcher, you could at least see what you were getting. The color, the smell, the texture gave some information, even if it was incomplete. When you bought a meat pie from a cookshop, the filling was sealed inside a pastry crust. What was inside was whatever the cook had put there. Old meat from yesterday's unsold stock was a standard ingredient for pies, not because every cook was dishonest, but because the economics of a cookshop required using everything and wasting nothing. The same incentive that drove the butcher to disguise old meat drove the cook to encase it in pastry where nobody could see it. London's cookshop regulations from the late 1300s attempted to address the most obvious abuses. Cooks were prohibited from reheating meat that had been cooked the previous day. Pies could not contain meat from 2 different days of slaughter. Meat pies could not be sold after dark, when the buyer could not inspect what was being offered. The fact that these specific prohibitions existed confirms that every single one of these practices was common. And the enforcement, such as it was, relied on market wardens who could inspect the cookshops during business hours but could not control what happened in the kitchen before dawn, when tomorrow's pies were being assembled from today's leftovers. The cookshop was the final link in the chain, the place where every upstream problem converged into a single product that concealed its contents behind a wall of pastry. A meat pie from a 1200s London cookshop might contain fresh mutton. It might contain yesterday's pork. It might contain a creative combination of offal, gristle, and whatever else the cook had available. The buyer would not know until the pie was opened, and by then, the transaction was complete. Milk is the product that completes the picture, because milk was the one item at the medieval market that was almost always adulterated, and almost always in the same way. Milk was sold by the volume. The seller was paid by how much liquid was in the container. The incentive was obvious: add water. Watered milk was so common that it was essentially the default product. If you bought milk at a 1200s English market, what was actually being purchased was milk-flavored water of unknown dilution. The water itself might be contaminated, drawn from the same wells and streams that served as the neighborhood's waste disposal. The milk, even undiluted, had no pasteurization, no refrigeration, and no testing. It had been collected that morning, if the seller was honest, or the previous day, if the seller was not. In warm weather, unpasteurized milk begins to sour within hours. Bacteria multiply rapidly. The product that a mother carried home to feed her family was, by the time it reached the table, a bacterial culture of unknown composition. And the water that had been added to stretch it might contain its own contribution of pathogens from whatever source the seller had access to. Milk was cheap. Milk was dangerous. And milk was the primary source of nutrition for the very young and the very old, the populations least able to withstand what it contained. There is a detail about the milk trade that deserves mention because it illustrates a principle that applied to every product at the market. The milk seller had no way to prove that her milk was undiluted, and the buyer had no way to prove that it was. There was no test for dilution. There was no standard for what milk should contain. The transaction was based entirely on trust, and in a market where every seller had the same incentive to adulterate, trust was a commodity in even shorter supply than the products themselves. The buyer's only protection was reputation. A seller known to water her milk heavily would lose customers to a seller who watered it slightly less. This was not food safety. This was a market correction operating at the speed of gossip, in a city where gossip was the only information system. And it worked, approximately. It kept the worst offenders somewhat in check. It did not make the milk safe. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Step back from the individual products and look at the system. The Assize of Bread and Ale regulated weight and price. The market regulations prohibited specific forms of fraud, selling old fish as new, mixing old meat with fresh. The punishments were public and sometimes severe: the pillory, the hurdle, fines, brief imprisonment. The system was not absent. It was present, active, and enforced. What it was not, what it could not be, was a food safety system in any way you would recognize. The concept of food safety, as a modern person understands it, requires microbiology. It requires the knowledge that invisible organisms cause disease. It requires the ability to test for contamination that cannot be seen, smelled, or tasted. None of these things existed in 1200s England. The market regulations controlled what could be controlled: weight, price, and the most obvious forms of visible fraud. Everything below the threshold of visibility, everything that actually killed people, was outside the system's reach. Not because the system was lazy, because the system was operating at the edge of what its civilization's knowledge allowed. And at that edge, the most dangerous things were also the most invisible. A day of shopping at a 1200s English market, purchasing bread, meat, ale, and milk, was a cumulative exposure to risks that no participant could see and no authority could measure. The chalk in the bread reduced its nutritional value. The bacteria on the meat began multiplying the moment it left the butcher's stall. The ale, if it was past its shelf life, introduced wild yeasts and bacteria. The milk was diluted with water of unknown safety. Each product carried its own invisible cargo. And the person who bought them all, who carried them home, prepared them, fed them to a family, was making decisions with no information. Not bad decisions, decisions without information. There is a difference. The medieval buyer was not careless. The medieval buyer was operating in a system that did not and could not provide the information needed to make safe choices. The knowledge gap was not personal. It was civilizational. And the consequences were absorbed by the bodies of every person who ate and drank what the market provided. If you had access to a modern food safety laboratory and tested every product at a 1200s market stall, the results would close the market permanently. But the laboratory did not exist. The tests did not exist. And the market continued every morning, every week, every year, because it was the only source of food the city had. The market closed at sundown. That was regulation. Trading after dark was prohibited, partly to prevent fraud that was easier in dim light, partly because the market needed to be cleared and cleaned before the next day. When the last stalls were packed up and the last customers walked home, the medieval world changed. Not gradually, completely. Sunlight was the organizing principle of medieval life. Everything happened in it. Everything depended on it. And when it disappeared, when the sun dropped below the horizon and the streets went dark, a different set of rules applied. The market was dangerous by day, but what came after sundown was a different kind of danger entirely. Next time, what happened when the light went out? Because medieval night was not dark the way you understand dark. It was the kind of dark where the walls disappear. And in that darkness, things were moving. On the floor, on the walls, on the people trying to sleep. That's next.